Good afternoon to everybody. Last week, I'm sorry for this delay. This machine took so long to respond. In the last week discussion, we discussed studying Buddhism philosophically, and in that I outlined 3 manners of doing philosophical studies. Particularly, we looked at aspects like examining, analyzing, investigating, and right. Thanks. So things of that nature, and then we looked at these things fairly comprehensively. So today I would move into what I would like to call conceptual studies. Having studied how to study Buddhism philosophically, conceptual studies is in a way in some respects similar to philosophical studies, but what is meant by this method is to study concepts of the Dhamma or the Vinaya or any doctrinal or Vinaya related concepts in order to make clear their meaning, application, relation to other concepts, their relevance to the ultimate goal, etc. So basically what we mean by conceptual study, conceptual study can be Dhamma on the Vinaya. Dhamma means Dhamma, Abhidhamma, and the Vinaya. In such study we are looking for their meaning, their application, their relation to other concepts, and their relevance to the ultimate goal. This type of study may be done by analyzing various instances of that concept in Buddhist canonical literature, commentaries and sub-commentaries, etc. And example for this kind of studies, one example is Rupert Getting's work, The Buddhist Path to Awakening, which studies in depth the 37 factors of enlightenment, Bodhipakkhya Dhamma. So let me explain a little bit what we mean by this conceptual study. Now basically, you take a concept in Dhamma or in the Vinaya and do a deep study of such concepts. That is meant by conceptual study. So I think in addition to textual studies, perhaps most of you are concerning with conceptual studies. Now conceptual studies can be any particular concept. Say, for example, if you study Vinaya, you can be studying the concept of apatti, concept of parajika, concept of sanghadisesa, concept of dandakamma, anything, any aspect of Vinaya can be a conceptual study. So any concept you can study. Whatever the concept you study deeply in the canonical literature, and also looking at the commentarial literature and sub-commentarial literature. Now that type of study is conceptual study. And also when you take Dhamma, it can be Kamma concept, or it can be Paticcasamuppada, there are hundreds of concepts in the Dhamma. You can take any of those things and do a conceptual study. So conceptual study is basically a study of the concept, Dhamma, or the Vinaya, or it can be Abhidhamma. Okay? Now, any type of concept, when you study it, you basically study for its meaning, and also you are looking for its application. You are looking for the relation to other concept, and also you are looking at the relevance to the ultimate goal. Now, basically, the conceptual study has to be studied in totality of the Dhamma. Now, what I mean by that is, something like when we look at the Dhamma as, say what we mean by totality of the Dhamma. Now, you take the Dhamma as the basic structure. How can you locate the concept within that main framework is the most important thing, okay? Now, you can study a subject in isolation, or you can study a subject in the context. Now, most important thing is out of these two things, you say a study in isolation or a study in the context. Now, context can be, we can say, relative, or we can say limited context, or context can be total context. Now, studying something in isolation is not very helpful, and also methodologically that is not very successful or correct methodology, because you just study subject as in particular on its own. You can come up with certain things about the subject, but of course it's not very successful. You are just studying a particular concept, dealing with its aspects, but without any connection to the totality of the subject. Now, important thing is in here, a subject or anything has to be, for that matter, a study in the context. Now, context, what I mean by context is, it can be two things. Say, for example, you study something in the relatively or limited context, and you study something in the total context. What I mean by this distinction is, now, say for example, you are studying a concept of, like karma. You can make a study of karma within the good and bad, right and wrong, and that aspect. So karma aspect. Now within the karma aspect, you take the karma aspect. Suppose you are talking karma in negative sense, akusala kamma or something. Then you have to take the whole context of karma, kusala kamma, akusala kamma, and so on. Now that is a limited context you are studying. Okay. Now suppose you are looking at the total context, then of course you have to take the concept of karma within the total concept of Buddhism. What is the role, what is the place of that concept within the totality of the teaching of the Buddha? And also ultimately how this particular concept is connected to the goal of Buddhism. There can be rather kind of limited context, like the goals like dhyana or things like that, but then larger applicability of how it is relative to applicable to the concept of final liberation. Now that is the total context. So you take any kind of concept and then you study that concept in context. So context can be a limited context. Context can be the total context. Okay. Now this is basically the study of concept. Now, for example, if you take the Vinaya. Now, Vinaya you can study within the context of Vinaya as a Vinaya concept within the Vinaya. However, something very important to remember is, can you discuss Vinaya taking it out from the complete context of Dhamma is an important thing. Now, particularly in the Theravada tradition, sometimes we tend to think that Vinaya is the main thing. Now, we have this historical example when it came to the first Sanghayana, according to Samantapasadika, Venerable Mahakassapa, who was the chairman of the council, he asked from the Sangha what should they recite first. Then the monks who present respond, Vinayo nama bhante sasanassa ayu, tasma vinayan sangayissama. Vinaya is the life of the sasana, therefore we will the chant recite Vinaya. Now it is true that if you take sasana as an organization has to have Vinaya, discipline. So Vinaya is the sasana of the ayu. However, what is the meaning of sasana? When you say sabba papassa karanam kusalassa upasampada sachitta pariyodapanam etang buddhana sasanam. What is the sasana there? Buddhanam sasana. Now, sasana is basically the teaching or the message of the Buddha. When you say etang buddhana sasanam, it is not the Sangha organization. It is basically message of the Buddha. Maybe at the first Sanghayana, when the bhikkhus responded to Venerable Mahakassapa saying that Vinayo nama sasanassa ayu, their sasana could be in the organization of the Sangha. Now, if you take the organization of the Sangha, yes, Vinaya is the ayu. However, if you take the Buddha's teaching entirely, I don't think it is correct to say that Vinaya is the ayu of the Buddha's teaching. Anyway, it is for you to think. Okay. Now, if you take these two concepts, Sila and the Vinaya. We know from the very beginning of Buddhism, Buddha's message, Buddha's teaching, you have Sila, Samadhi, Panya. Right? Sila is there. Sila, Samadhi, Panya. So, Tiso Sikha, three type of training is Sila, Samadhi, Panya. So, Sila is there from the very beginning. However, Vinaya was not there from the very beginning. We know in the Theravada belief, Vinaya rules were prescribed by the Buddha after 20 years of Buddhahood. That is what they say. Now, there is a very important distinction between, you know it, Sila and the Vinaya. Right? Sila is basically first part of training. Sila, Samadhi, Panya. So you start with Sila, Sile Patittaya. Then you go into Chittang Panyancha Bhavayam, development of concentration and also insight, Vipassana. So there is no question about the necessity of Sila. However, Vinaya comes later. Vinaya rules were required for the organization. Organization grew up subsequently. Buddha did not start with the organization, right? There was no organization to begin with. But gradually organization came up, and then after some time, organization needed some rules. So the Vinay came. Vinay rules came. However, what is the basis of Vinay rules? You take the rules. Now, Vinay rules are very important. It says something very interesting organizationally. What does it say organizationally? It says organizationally, if you violate Vinay, you get punishment. Okay? So, you get punishment. If you violate Vinay, you are punished. Because Vinay is the law. If you, whole point of law is, if you violate it, then you are punished. But think about the Sila. If you violate the Sila, you are not punished. Don't do that, but that is what it means. You can violate the Sila, but for violating Sila, you are not punished. Because Sila is not the law. Sila, Samadhi, Panya. Now, of course, in the Buddhist Sila, when I say Panatipata, Veramani, Sikkhapadang, Samadhiyami, I say I undertake it to observe. Nobody is putting it on me. I undertake. Having undertaken, if I don't do it, then it is my problem. But when you enter the Sasana as organization, you are bound by Vinay rules. When you get higher ordination, you are bound by Vinay rules. When you get into nunhood, you are bound by certain Vinay rules. Now, that is not your voluntary thing. If you get the membership, you have to do that, whether you like it or not. Sila is not like that, okay? So, violating Sila, you don't get punished, but violating Vinaya, you get punished. So, there is a very important distinction between Sila and the Vinaya. Now, my point here is this. Now, if you really study a Vinaya, now Vinaya can be studied within the context of Vinaya. But ultimately, that will be the Vinaya, studying within the context of Vinaya will be relative and limited context. However, Vinaya studying within the totality of the Dhamma is, it is ultimately Vinaya in the context of entire Dhamma, entire teaching of the Buddha. Okay, it is very important to see when you do a conceptual Vinaya study, Vinaya gets its authority. Vinaya gets its power from the Dhamma. Okay? Now, all the Vinaya rules are ultimately related to the Dhamma. The meaning of the Vinaya rules ultimately have to be explicated basis on the Dhamma. Now, in the Vinaya, you know that there are, we refer to two types of crimes or wrong things. They are called Lokavajja and Panyattivajja. So there is this distinction of one is Lokavajja. So the other is Panyattivajja. Lokavajja means what are not good, what are wrong according to the general acceptance in the world. They are considered to be wrong. So, killing is wrong. That's a Lokavajja. Stealing is wrong. That's a Lokavajja. So, there are these kinds of Lokavajja. Lokavajja is wrong. There is no question about it. Lokavajja is wrong for anybody. Whether you are a Buddhist or Buddhist monk or Buddhist nun or anybody, if you kill somebody, then you are guilty of something according to the state or the country law. Right? I mean, if you steal something, then again you are guilty of doing something wrong. That is Lokavajja. However, there are certain things, what I call Panyattivajja. Panyattivajja is Vajja that is Vajja or wrong, simply because Buddha has said so. Now, this concept is very important. Panyattivajjas are not really ethically wrong things. For example, for a monk to shouting and running on the road is not good. But shouting and running on the road is not an ethically bad thing. There's nothing wrong in that. Okay? There are simple things like that. Now, it is wrong only for the monk who has accepted to live that life. But apart from that, it is not ethically wrong thing. So that is called Panyati Vajja. Now, there are lots of things like that. In the Buddhist monastic Vinaya, even if you take the first Parajika is not a Loka Vajja. First Parajika is a Panyati Vajja. It is wrong simply because it has been said to be wrong by the Buddha. Now, Sangha the Bhikkhuni life has, around 8 Parajikas. Most of these things are wrong because they are Panyati Vajja. Now, why Panyati Vajja is there? In order to understand the need of Panyati Vajja, you can't go to Vinaya, you have to go to the Dhamma. Now, there are certain things not proper for a monk or nun to do, mainly because a monk or nun is committed to live a life ultimately lead into the Nirvana. So if you are living a life leading to the Nirvana, there can be certain things that are not proper for you. But those very same things can be all right for a person who is not trying to attain Nirvana. So Panyati Vajja is a very interesting thing. Why Panyati Vajja is wrong? Because it contradicts the ultimate goal. So if you want to discuss Panyati Vajja, one basic question, why Panyati Vajja is wrong, you have to refer to the Nirvana, final goal. Without referring to the final goal, you can't make sense why Panyati Vajja is wrong. Now, therefore, in a Vinaya study, ultimately, Vinaya rules make sense with reference to the totality of the Dhamma. Okay? So, the Dhamma is the basis of the Vinaya. It is on the basis of Vinaya, Dhamma has been, it is on the basis of Dhamma, the Vinaya rules have been prescribed by the Buddha. Now, if you can really analyze what I am saying, and you can try to establish it, prove it, with reference to certain Vinaya rules. Okay. Now, what I am trying to tell you here is, we don't study something in isolation. We are studying something in the context. Studying something in the context can have a relative context, or studying something in context can have a larger context. So you are studying something, any Dhamma matter, in the larger context of the teaching of the Buddha. Okay. Now, Venerables, what I am saying is not something new. Of course, it makes sense according to the modern research methodology. But not only that, it makes sense also according to the ancient Buddhist methodology. Why I say this? Because most of you are familiar with the two texts called Netti and Petakopadesa, right? In the Kuttaka, Netti and Petakopadesa. Now, I think in the Burmese tradition, these are included in the Kuttaka Nikaya, but in Sri Lanka tradition, they are not included in the Kuttaka Nikaya. Okay, that's a different thing. But if you take Netti and Petakopadesa, there are a lot of studies done on these two texts. Now, the most interesting thing in Netti and Petakopadesa, now Petaka Upadesa. Petaka Upadesa means guide to the Pitaka. So it is meant to be an interpretational text. How to understand, how to interpret the teaching of the Buddha. Now, a lot of scholars consider Netti to be a more developed version of the Petakopadesa itself. Although two texts are somewhat different, two texts are meant to do the same thing. So basically today, people pay attention to Netti more because Netti is a more systematic presentation of the content of Petakopadesa. There are again differences of opinion. Some Theravada tradition seems to be considered that Petakopadesa is the main text. There is a debate. But the important thing is, particularly Netti and Petakopadesha both, but if I take Netti in particular, what is the Netti? Netti comes from Nayati, act of Nayati. Nayati means take something to some place, Nayati. Netti means the means of taking some point to some other point, Netti. Now what is this idea of Netti? Taking some point from some point to some point. Actually what it means is ultimately, it is very clearly said that when you study the Dhamma or when you study any particular sutta, you have to be able to connect that sutta to the totality of all the other suttas. Now actually what it means is nothing other than you have to understand a particular sutta in the context of all the other suttas. In other words, whatever the sutta you are discussing, you must be able to connect it to the entire teaching of the Buddha. You have to show where does it fit in the teaching of the Buddha. Now keep this thing in mind very much, because you can do a study in isolation. What it means is, in an isolationist study, you are not really locating that particular concept or anything you are studying in the total picture. Such a study is always lacking in clarity and comprehension, because you don't know really where it leads to. You don't know really where it connected to, So Netti is a very good example. And Netti has teaching, the method called Hara. Netti has Hara. So Hara is also coming from Harati. Harati is like Nayati. So Harati and Nayati are both in Pali language similar concepts. So Hara. Now Hara is the means by which you take concept to a concept. Hara. So there are different haras. Now if you look at these haras, you can see that hara's function is to connect a particular sutta to the totality of the whole suttas. Okay? So Sara has that function. So you are located here, but you must be able to see how it is located to the entire teaching. Now, in the teaching of the Buddha, Buddhist tradition, we have the idea that the Dhamma has only one taste, namely the taste of Nirvana, taste of liberation. Dhammo eka raso, one taste. What is that taste? Vimutti raso. Dhamma has the rasa of the liberation. So Dhamma has the rasa of the liberation. Now, in this Netti method, you must be able to show any particular sutta has the taste of liberation, or any particular sutta has connection to the liberation. Any particular sutta has the relevance to the path. That is a remarkable thing in the Buddhist tradition. In other words, from the ancient times, we know that we can't do isolated studies. But this ancient method is really also a modern method. Even in the modern perspective, in the modern research methodology, whenever you are studying something in context, you have to show particular concept, how it is connected to the totality. I will give you one or two examples. Now, one example that comes into my mind is, you see one of the Sri Lankan scholars, Y. Karunadasa. He wrote this, the book called Buddhist Analysis of Matter. He wrote it in 1960s, long time ago, as his PhD dissertation. But even up till today, this book remains a very authoritative book on the subject, Buddhist Analysis of Matter. So that is really the Abhidhamma Rupa Viggaha. It's a book about Abhidhamma. It is a book about Rupa, Buddhist analysis of matter. The point I want to make is this. Now, this is the Buddhist analysis of matter. It's about one part of Abhidhamma. So, if you take Tripitaka, Sutta Vinaya Abhidhamma, and if you take Abhidhamma, Chitta Chetasika Rupa, so it's only one part. Out of the Tripitaka, you go to one Pitaka. In that one Pitaka, you take one concept, right? So, you can see that, how you select concept. So concepts can be like, lying down somewhere in the system. However, if you look at this book, I think it is available online and also should be in the library. You look at the last chapter of that book. Now, last chapter of that book shows how analysis of Rupa is connected to the attainment of Nirvana. He refers to various discourses and shows how understanding Rupa. Now, that's very interesting because he is discussing Abhidharma concept of Rupa, that's all. But if he wanted, he can just stop just discussing Rupa concept according to Abhidharma. But he goes to discourses and he shows how Rupa, you remember in the morning we discussed Aniccan, Dukkham, Patissamuppannan, Khaya Dhammam, Vaya Dhammam, Viraga Dhammam, Nirodha Dhammam and so on. So you take the concept of Rupa and he shows how understanding of Rupa is necessary in order to understand, realize Nirvana. Now, this is the point I am trying to make here. You can't just study Rupa without connecting it to the total picture of the Dhamma. So, what I am saying is, you can do conceptual studies. It can be Abhidhamma, it can be Vinaya, it can be Dhamma or Sutta or particular Sutta. But you must be able to connect these suttas particularly to the totality of the entire teaching. Now, in this, my presentation, I reference to this example for this kind of Rupert Gettings. Now, this is also fairly old now. It was published in 1980s, I think, The Buddhist Path to Awakening. Now, Buddhist Path to Awakening, he discussed 37 Bodhipakkhiya Dhamma. Any of you have seen this book? No. Okay. But this is actually one of the very good books. Very good books. Now, there are many good things in the book, of course. But, one very good thing is, you can see that on the one hand, you take 37 Bodhipakkhiya Dhamma. So within the Bodhipakkhiya Dhamma, you have all these aspects of, the Bodhipakkhiya Dhamma, Chattaro Satipatthana, and so on and so forth. And Rupert Getting discusses them very in-depth manner, referring to the Sutta and Abhidhamma, both. And also he shows how, this analysis of 37 Bodhipakkhiya Dhamma are useful, necessary, or essential in order to attain Nirvana. So again, I can say you that you can have this discussion in two ways. You can just have a discussion on 37 Bodhipakkhiya Dhamma, but such discussion is not complete. A complete conceptual study has to be study locating a particular concept within the totality of the concept. Okay. Now remember that not only for this kind of study, whenever you study any kind of any concept, any subject, any particular thing, that's perfectly okay so long as you see the connection of that. So long as you see this particular thing as part of the larger whole. Okay? The whole problem is this. If you don't do that, then that concept stays isolatedly. It doesn't have a relation. It doesn't have a purpose. You don't know where it is located. Understanding a person, now if I may talk from Buddhist, say, Patthana, you are always chanting Patthana. But Patthana shows that something has to be understood in relation to other things. According to Buddhist analysis, understanding something means not only you understand that particular thing, you also understand how that particular thing is related to other things. So, Patthana gives this idea relations. So, when you study things, you study things. But of course, relations are not things. Relations are more like psychological creations. But in order to understand something properly, you have to understand also the relations. Okay? So, what I am saying is really both according to Nettipakarana and Petokopadesha and also according to Patthana. Now, in other words, it's very interesting to see that methodology for research we have in Buddhism. If you really do it, methodology for research we have in Buddhism. Okay? Now, if we really take, these ancient Buddhist texts seriously, we can learn quite a lot of things, how to do research. Now, particularly Netti and Petokopadesha are texts that teach how to do a conceptual study. Because those ancient teachers, they realized that any concept has to be meaningful within the context. Now, one bad thing of not doing that is, like you take a concept isolatedly, then what happens? You always give a wrong emphasis. For example, if you take dukkha, suffering, if you take it in isolation and then you do a very big study on dukkha, then you give the impression that Buddhism is only talking about suffering. That's wrong. So whenever you do a study of dukkha, you have to really show how dukkha is related to the other things. Otherwise, what happens is this whole thing becomes, as if, Buddhism is only dukkha. But Buddhism is not only dukkha. Buddhism has quite a lot of other things. So if you locate the dukkha in a particular context, then you see how it is related to the others. Then also you see that Buddhism is not only dukkha. Buddhism has dukkha samudaya, dukkha nirodha gamini patipada, and all these things are there. So you put the concept in particular context. You see it in the totality. Every time you take something isolatedly, it looks very big. Right? But if you put in the context, then it is right proportion. Taking in isolation, it appears very big. But putting it in the context, we know where it belongs to and what is its size. Anything is like that. Our ears, our eyes, our nails and everything, they are nice when they are fit into a picture. But if you just take my eye separately and make it a huge thing, it doesn't look nice. My eye size is this much because relative to my body. So in order to understand eye, you have to understand the body. It's something like that, pretty simple idea. But this particular methodology, you find in the Buddhist context all the time. So in the Netti and Petokopadesha we have that, and in the Patthana we have that. We are studying relations. So studying something as a related concept is the most important thing. So when you look at the research, you always must have this idea in your mind. Suppose some of you are doing conceptual studies, what I am calling, but think about this particular concept as a part of the whole. Then only you see proper this particular context from a proper perspective. So understanding So this whole concept of context is a new word. But even though we did not have the word context, if you take Nethi and Petakopadesa, what they have been talking is really the context. So in other words, getting something into any kind of concept into that total picture and understand it through the total picture. Okay, I think I made my idea clear to you. So conceptual studies are quite popular among the researchers in Buddhism. It's okay, it's good really. But very often these conceptual studies become not very successful when they are not studied within the context. And also when they are not studied along with the various relationships, how they are related to other concepts, how they are conducive to develop other virtues or things. So put in that manner, a conceptual study can be a challenging thing actually. So I think the best thing for you to do is to be acquainted with some of the good conceptual studies like what I said, the Professor Karunadasa's Buddhist analysis of matter, and also Rupert Getting's work. These are some of the interesting things you can develop. Before proceeding any further, I would like to see whether if you have any questions or comments, hear to them and then we can proceed. Do you have any questions or comments about this?
You mentioned between Sila and Vinaya.
Yeah.
They are different.
Yeah.
But previously I believe that they are.
Mm-hmm.
Why you said they are?
No, in fact, thank you for that question, good question. I tried to locate the two aspects also within the system and also part of chronologically. Now, one point I made this, I said Sila started before Vinaya. Okay? Now, Sila is the one basic concept in the Sila Samadhi Panya. So, in other words, if you take the path taught by the Buddha, you have the Sila. However, the Sila is something you need. If you take Nirvana can be realized by both lay people and monks, or Pabbajita, Gihi and Pabbajita. Obviously, the Sila is different for two people, right? But then, do you think that Buddha had the Vinaya for lay people? Why? If you think Buddha did not have Vinaya for lay people, why? There is no Vinaya for lay people. Now, 5 precepts are not really Vinaya. If a lay person breaks 5 precepts, there is nobody to punish you. Of course, if a lay person kills somebody, government will punish you. If a lay person steals something, government will punish you. But there is no Buddhist organization to punish him. Because Panchasila is not Vinaya. Now, this is the difference between Sila and the Vinaya. Now, Vinaya always involved with punishment. Actually, there are a lot of stories. Buddha, when the Sariputta wanted to have Vinaya rules at one time, Buddha said, no, I will know the time. And when the Balananda wanted to have Vinaya rules, Buddha said, no, I will know the time. In other words, Buddha did not like to have Vinaya rules. Because, Vinaya rules we observe simply because we don't like the punishment. Because the rules, laws are always associated with punishment. But if you observe Sila, it is not because you are scared of punishment. So the Vinaya is equivalent to Buddhist law. It goes with punishment. But Sila is not law, so Sila is not punishment. If you don't observe Sila, you will not attain Nirvana. That's your problem. Buddha has nothing to do with that. In the Anguttara Nikaya, I remember there is a very interesting story. One monk come to the Buddha and he says, there are these 150 Sikkhapadas, I can't observe all this. Of course, you can see that it was a early development of Patimokkana, because now you have 220. But he refers to 150. He says, I can't follow these 150 rules. Buddha says, fine, forget about 100. Can you do 3? Then he says, yeah, I mean, if you are fed up with 150, 3 is fine. He said, yes. What is the meaning of this story? Now this particular monk is worried about the number of the rules. But on the other hand, Buddha was not very particular about the rules either. He said, okay, forget about 150. Can you do 3 things? Now the funny thing is, when you do 3 things, automatically 150 are observed. Now, Reverend, that is the difference between the Vinaya and the Sila. Now, when the Buddha said, can you do 3 things, what he meant is what? Adi Sila Sikha, Adi Chitta Sikha, and Adi Panya Sikha, right? Now, Buddha goes back to the Sila. Because when you are really observing Sila, your all 220 are observed. But sometimes you can observe all 220, but not necessarily Sila. Connection to the other side is, not always, because if you read Vinaya Atthakatha, you can see that, for a Upasampada monk, cutting this tree is not proper. Also, you cannot ask anyone to cut it. But if you use the proper language, you can get someone to cut the tree, but you are not guilty. Now what is going on there? You say that I don't like this tree here or something like that. Then other person has to understand, okay, he wants me to cut this and he cut it. But technically you did not ask him to cut, right? So your Sikkhapada is, Vinaya rule is okay, but actually you violated it. Because you got someone to cut it. But only thing is, your letter of your rule is okay, but the spirit of the rule is not. No, I mean, what I'm trying to say is, this is the distinction. So the Sila and Vinaya are different. But I'm not saying that always, if you are Vinaya, if you observe all the Vinaya, of course your Sila is there, that's true. But on the other hand, there is a clear distinction between the two. So you can be a very, very good Vinaya person, but not necessarily Sila always. So Sila is the ideal thing, is the path. Now, for example, that is why, suppose a lay person who has never become a monk, who has never observed the Vinaya, but according to Buddhism still can be meditating and can attain Arahanthood, although it is difficult, but can. So that shows that Sila is needed, but not the Vinaya necessarily. Because Vinaya is for the monastic organization. Actually, the monastic organization has lasted because of the Sila. Because the monks respect the Vinaya. So organization has lasted as organization. But that's a different matter. Because any good organization has to have a good legal structure. That's what is provided by the Vinaya. But then within the Vinaya, Sila has to be observed voluntarily. That's the difference. So even, this distinction, good that you asked that question, I mean, you are perfectly okay, you can disagree with me, but if you can prove that what Asanga Tilakaratna says is wrong, that's a good research. You can write a good paper. Or you can think about the difference between the Sila and the Vinaya. That can be a part of, the good research paper you can write. And
just only one thing you that Vinaya are concerned with the punishment, but Sila not concerned with punishment. But the Buddha said if you kill a living being not for the monks, for all, you will be shot left like that. It's a chemical that punishment.
Well, it's a good point. I referred to Lokavajja and Panyativajja. Actually, the Lokavajja, if you violate, you write. You go to apaya. And also you are doing something bad. There's no question about that. But Vinaya deals also more with Panyativajja. Now, Panyativajja don't take you to hell, apaya. No, it does not. Now, let me give you a very extreme example. You take the first parajika, Metuna Dhamma. Now, for a Upasampada bhikkhu, he loses the monkhood. But does that mean that, you violate the Sikkhapada, you lose the monkhood, because of that you go to apaya? No. If you go to apaya, you will go to apaya if you hide it and pretend to be a Buddhist monk and, live like that. That is wrong. But simply because you violate the parajika and then, you think I violate the parajika and I go home, or I become a samanera. That's perfectly okay. You are not going to go to apaya because of that. Because that is not something killing like a human being or stealing. There is a difference between the two. Don't do that. But what I'm saying is, there is an important difference between the two. By running on the road shouting, you are not going to go to apaya. But people will not like that very much. So people will be upset. People lose their saddha. So Buddha said, don't do that. You remember in the Vinaya we have always manussa, ujjayanti, khiyanti, vipachanti. Buddha came up with a lot of Vinaya rules because people didn't like some of that behavior. There are so many stories. One day when Vishaka was coming to the monastery, it was raining and all the monks are having bath naked outside. That was kind of weird thing, but it's perfectly okay. But Vishaka didn't like it. So she said to the Buddha, these monks are looking like Nigantas. They are having naked, they are having bath. Then Buddha prohibited it. Buddha came up with the Sikkhapada. But the difference between this. Now, that type of taking bath became wrong after the Sikkhapada. Before Sikkhapada, it was not wrong. It is only wrong for the monks, not for others, ordinary people. So this is thing. So don't mix up these two categories, Panyativajja and Lokavajja. So Lokavajjas will take you to apaya. Bad result. Also bad for the society. But of course, Buddhist monk running on the road, laughing or shouting, of course it will not good for the sasana because people will not, you will not get the pindapata properly next day. But that's not a issue like killing or stealing or something. So in other words, Reverend, I like the point you make. Kamma vipaka and the Vinaya Sikkhapada are two different things. Only Lokavajja violation will have Kamma vipaka, not the Panyativajja. Okay? So we can put it the distinction like that. So Lokavajja violation will have a bad karma vipaka, but not the Panyativajja. Organizationally and also the final goal wise, sometimes Panyativajja can be even serious. Now again you take the first parajika. Now why it is first parajika? Because ultimately nirvana is to get rid of all the desires. So you see, that is the connection. So if whatever you do increases your desire, it's not good for nirvana. So that is very serious so far as the path is concerned. But if you take the social wise, if you kill a human being, that's going to be a very serious thing. If you steal somebody's thing, that's going to be very, very serious thing. So the seriousness can be both. Seriousness can be serious to the society, to the world, and serious can be serious to the purpose of the sasana. So there are certain things, purpose of the sasana. So like first parajika or, similar things. But Lokavajja are always serious social violence. So it depends on, what kind of,
situation.
yes, what type of, the violations we are talking.
What was the law Takatesa? You know,
Which one?
Oscar Desai, after he was dead, he became drunk. You know the story, the law Takatesa.
I didn't get the name, but what happened to him?
There was a monk, that he drank and crashed.
Yeah, right. Okay, I know the story. Now again, the interesting thing, he was born not because of he the grass, but he was mentally so remorseful. His mind.
Yeah.
But why he was mentally so remorseful? He took these precepts very seriously and he thought he violated something and he became very upset. As a result, he was, but not because he cut grass, but simply because he was such a Vinaya rule person, so he did not want to violate, and then simple violation caused him lot of mental agony. So because of that agony, he, so it affects. But, if you really understand, like what the Buddha said, forget about 150, just do 3. I mean, that's very practical, again, you can't misuse what the Buddha said. But what the Buddha said is, the spirit. Because when you preserve Sila Samadhi Panya, your all the Vinaya rules are practically preserved. Okay. Yeah.
I want to know more the example. Identity means we study in the context relative.
Yeah.
So what concept relates?
Actually, what I mean by this is following. Now, when you say context relative or limited, again take a Vinaya concept. So long as you study the Vinaya concept within the Vinaya, totality of the Vinaya, we can say that you are doing it a limited context. So you can do Vinaya study without any context. Then better to do a limited context. But totality means you take a Vinaya in the context of ultimately Dhamma. So you can, if you can connect it to the Dhamma, then of course you are studying in the totality. Now the Buddha's teaching is not only Vinaya, not only Abhidhamma, not only Sutta. Of course, Sutta you can say yes, but Abhidhamma and Vinaya. Now that's why Karunadasa's work, I said it is on Abhidhamma, Rupa. But then he connected it to the entire Nirvanic process. So that is the total context. Even though you study Abhidhamma, Rupa, even in the Rupa you can be studying one particular Rupa like Pataviyapo Tejo Vayo, or Upadaya Rupa, or whatever. But then you must be able to go beyond that and put the picture in the totality. So within limited context you can do, within a total context you can do, but not in any context is bad. Just isolatedly,
How about that? The limited.
No, I'm using that word because I didn't have a better word, But what I mean is, limited context.
Limited, I understand. I mean, this tradition, when we put this concept in this tradition and another tradition.
Well, actually, I did not touch that, but we can go to that. Now, if you can study something in this Buddhist context, but then you can do, even in the Buddhist context, you can look at all the Buddhist traditions, or even go beyond Buddhist traditions and look from the perspective of all the religions. Actually, my next topic is interreligious study. I will talk about that. So it depends on, what you want to do. But at least you have to locate it within the particular context. I mean, if you want to go to other Buddhist traditions, Vajrayana and Mahayana, fine. But of course, that's up to you. You don't have to. Or if you want to go to even other religions, again, that is up to you. You don't have to. It depends on you.
Well, we have a word that is Pakainaka Desana. How should we understand that word, Pakainaka Desana?
You mean Pakinnaka Deshana?
Yes.
That's in the part of the Vinaya or part of, you are referring to Vinaya?
That is maybe
Abhidhamma.
Abhidhamma or Sodana. We have
Yeah.
Sodana, yes.
Yeah, actually, Pakinnaka Deshana means the sections which deals with more than one aspect, like, Pakinnaka Desana. So Pakinnaka Desana has some relevance to what I'm talking here, because in the Pakinnaka Desana, you are putting things in a particular wider perspective. Okay, so it has something. But a better example would be like if you take Vinaya, Parajika Pachitya, Chullavaga Mahavagga, Parivara. Now, if you take Parivara, Parivara deals with all the content in the other 4 books. Now, Parivara can be really a contextual study because it deals with Sikshapadas of all the Sikshapadas and traditions, both Adi Brahmacharya and Abhisamacharika, found in other 4 books. So it's a kind of thing. Now, Pakinnaka is also like that. Pakinnaka is a mixed, complex. So it refers to the other things. So that's why I said, if you want to get the research methodology, we have research methodology actually. There's quite a lot. Now, Vinaya, you take, quite a lot of modern research aspects are there. Okay, we can talk about those things. Why don't you take a short break of 5 minutes and then we will get together again. Thank you. Next, what I'm going to do is comparative studies, and then again another important type of study in the modern studies is comparative study. Comparative studies involve studying 2 or several concepts or doctrines or ideas or institutions or organizations and so on, highlighting similarities and differences between or among them. This type of study may be done between different religious traditions, between different schools, or traditions within Buddhism itself, within the same tradition. For example, between Dhamma and the Vinaya, or between early and later suttas, etc. Now, first we make it clear what do we mean by comparative studies. Now, comparative studies, comparative means we compare. So there is the aspect of comparing. But actually this, although we use this word comparative, it is not only comparing, okay? It is not only comparing, but also contrasting. Contrasting means see the differences. Although we use the concept comparative, comparative doesn't necessarily mean. But one thing very important philosophically to distinguish at the very beginning is when you do a comparative study, there must be some type of reason, some type of justification to do a comparative study. Because in other words, there must be some point where within, suppose you are doing a study between 2 systems, there must be some point where, in the 2 systems, this particular concept occupies a similar place. For example, if you want to do example like a comparative study between Buddhist bhikkhus, Buddhist monks, and maybe Christian clergy. Now, both are religious group in 2 different traditions. So there can be differences and there can be similarities, right? But then we are taking Christian side, the Christian clergy, and from the Buddhist side, Buddhist monks, right? So then the point is that 2 are, although can be different status-wise or role-wise, they have certain similarity in the two traditions. Now, for example, you cannot do a comparative study, say Buddhist monks and Christian church helpers or something, because the two categories are not similar then, right? Something like that, like there must be some kind of agreement between the concepts you are. Although ultimately these concepts can be different, but still they must occupy a similar ground. Unless there is some kind of similarity or some kind of agreement, you can't really do a comparative study, right? So you can't talk about you can talk about, say, Buddhist text and maybe some other fundamental religious text in another religion. But you can't talk about the text in one religion and people in the other religion. Then categories are two different categories. Because what I'm saying is comparative studies, problematic thing, unless you do it really correctly. Because very often people misunderstand things. People misunderstand things just by looking at word. I remember one time a student came to me and asked whether she could do a comparative study between Christian Old Testament wisdom literature and Buddhist wisdom. Now, why this particular student thought she can do this study? Because you have wisdom literature, wisdom there. And also when you read Buddhism, you have the word wisdom. So then she thought that these two are similar. But we know that when we say in Buddhism wisdom, we are borrowing this English word for panya. So if you really look at wisdom literature in the Christianity and panya, then you see the difference. But in the translations, we call this thing to be in the Old Testament wisdom literature, and Buddhism we call the wisdom. But two are totally different things. Wisdom in Buddhism does not refer to a literature. Wisdom in Buddhism refers to the path. Okay? Now in the Christianity, wisdom refers to some part of the Old Testament of the Bible. Now how can you do a comparative study between the two? On the one hand, on the one side you have the literature, on the other side you have a path of the practice. Only similarity is the superficial similarity because of the English language. If we didn't know English, we would never use word wisdom to refer to panya. So you see where comparative studies can go wrong, because you see some superficial similarities. Now that is one problem. Another problem is when you say comparative study, people think that you have to really compare. You have to really show the similarities. Actually, similarities is not the issue, because the similar concepts can be serving many different purposes. Similar concepts can be. So now if you take the Christian clergy and the Buddhist monks, of course at some point there is a similarity. But they are function-wise, they are work-wise, and then they are the way of life-wise, there can be a lot of differences. So not only similarities, but also there are differences. And sometimes, we can see that in different traditions, people play similar roles. Say, for example, in the Buddhist tradition, Buddhist monk may be playing the counselor's role. Now, you can take any other tradition and the people who are playing the same role, and then you can do a comparative study. Although Buddhist monks and those people are different, you are taking them to be doing a similar function or identical function. In the Buddhist tradition, Buddhist monks do the counseling. In some other tradition, some other people are doing the counseling. But then you can take these two groups together similarities because they are doing the same thing, although they belong to different categories of people. Can you see that point? Because you can do a comparative study as far as the function is concerned, but not the way of life or things like that of a Buddhist monk and some other person. So identifying some kind of theme, suitable idea to comparative study is very important. So the basic difficulty is the moment you call comparative study, there must be certain telling point, agreements, certain points. Otherwise, there is no reason of selecting something to be. So initially there is understanding that there are certain points that are agreeable. I remember somebody said, even to fight, you have to be in an even platform, right? So two people are fighting, I am up here, other person is down here, you can't fight. So even to fight, you have to be on a similar. Now what it means is, in a comparison, there must be certain commonalities that you cannot deny. But you have to know exactly what you are doing. Now particularly when we talk about the comparative study, very often people do comparative studies of aspects of religion, right? And then, for example, you can talk about nirvana and kingdom of God in Christianity, And then people try to see similarities, but actually seeing similarities is not the point. Of course, kingdom of God is the final destination in Christianity, and nirvana is the final destination in Buddhism. So as final destination, yes, you can make a comparative study, right? But of course, that doesn't mean that the comparative study should really show that, Buddha talked about what the Buddha talked by nirvana is the kingdom of God or something. This is something very, very interesting and very important to be clear about. I will give you a different type of example. Say, for example, if you take a question like human rights. Okay, for example, you take a question like human rights. Then somebody can ask, okay, what did the Buddha say about human rights? So you can do a comparative study between Buddhism and, the human rights, But then the issue is this. The moment you say what the Buddha said about human rights, you are accepting that Buddha talked about human rights. Otherwise, how can you talk about the Buddhist, what the Buddha said about human rights? The moment you say the X is green, you say that X exists, right? In the same manner, the moment you talk about, what the Buddha said about human rights, you are saying that in 6th century BCE in India, Buddha talked about human rights. Did Buddha talk about human rights in India?
Yes.
Was there a concept like human rights in India during the time of the Buddha? See, this is a problem because concept of human right is something very new, originated as a concept in Europe. Okay? So, how can you talk about Buddha's views on human rights? Now, unless you make that point very clear, you are misleading. You assume that Buddha talked about human rights, human right discourse, or the way of talking about human rights was there at the time of the Buddha, and you are attributing all these things to the Buddha. I remember something very interesting articles by Damien Keown. If you want to read that, of course, it is available online. That's a very interesting article, actually. The author is Damien Keown, Damien Keown. His article is They are human rights in Buddhism. This is the article. Now, while some people talk about human rights in Buddhism, he raised this question, are there human rights in Buddhism? Now, what is the meaning of this question? When he raised this question, are there human rights in Buddhism? Actually, what he meant by this is what I just said. How can you say that Buddha talked about human rights in India 6th century BCE, whereas there was no concept called human rights in Buddhism? Right? However, on the other hand, that should not mean that Buddha did not say anything relevant to what we call human rights today. On the other hand, although Buddha did not have a concept called human rights, what we call human rights today, Buddha has said certain things that are relevant to it. But the very important thing is for you to be aware that when we say Buddha talked about human rights, in English we say it is anachronism. Because anachronism means it contradicts with the time. During the time of the Buddha, there was no discussion of human rights. There was no discussion of women's rights. There was no discussion of children's rights. There was no discussion of animal rights. All these are new things. However, if you want to talk about animal rights, Buddha has said certain things that are relevant to it. But at the same time, you must think rights. When you use the word right, it is a legal term. In the Western legal tradition, right is a term, right has a meaning. Now, can you use that same meaning to say that Buddha talked about the rights? No. Because the concept of right itself has a meaning. That meaning is found in the Western legal, political tradition. So you have to get that meaning and see, whether Buddha talked about these things. So actually what Damien Kean doing in this paper is something very interesting. He looks at this concept and he says, in this strict sense, you can't say that Buddha talked about human rights. Because human rights were non-existent by the time of the Buddha. You do not see things from the perspective of human rights. So there was no something called children's right, or there is no something called women's right. Although there was no something called children's right, did the Buddha not say anything about related to children? In the Sigalovada Sutta, Buddha has said. Did the Buddha not say things related to women, as wife, as mother, as sister? Buddha has said so much. So, which means you can make use of some of those things to discuss rights concept today. But if you start by saying, yes, Buddha has said about human rights, Buddha has said about women's rights, because sometimes we Buddhists have the tendency that all the new things have been said by the Buddha long time ago. That is not very good. We say that we are putting Buddha in a very great position by saying that, Buddha has said this about this before. Buddha knew about this before. But that is being very limited mind. Buddha may have knew a lot of things, but you can't say Buddha knew about human rights because the concept was not there. But what the Buddha said can be applicable to human rights today. Right? So we can say it is one thing to say that what the Buddha said can be applicable to human rights. It is another thing to say that Buddha talked about human rights. No, Buddha did not talk about human rights. So initially, fundamentally, that's why, whenever you make a comparative study, it is very, very important to see whether there is a similar concept between Buddhism and, whatever the other system you want to do. Now, as I said here, comparative studies involve studying two or several concepts. Those can be doctrines, ideas, institutions and organizations also, like Sangha organization and some other similar organization, highlighting similarities and differences between or among them. Now, this type of study may be done between different religious traditions. So, you can talk about between different religious traditions. Between different schools or traditions within Buddhism itself. Now, you can talk about a particular concept between Hinayana. Of course, we don't have so-called Hinayana school today, but between Hinayana schools and Mahayana schools. Or Theravada and Mahayana. Or Theravada, Mahayana and Vajrayana. So you can do those things. Now, those are within Buddhism. Actually, there is a distinction between what we call, we can say, inter-religious studies, and we can talk about intra-religious studies. Inter-religious means between two or more religions. Intra-religious means within the same religious tradition. Now, if you are making the conceptual study between, say, for example, what we call early Buddhism and later Buddhism, that is intra, not inter. Okay, that is within the Buddhist tradition. Or you make a study between Theravada, Mahayana and Vajrayana, that is intra. Of course, it can be called inter too, but we are talking about the within. Whenever you do some study within one tradition, then there are certain assumptions that are shared by all the traditions, and also there can be differences not shared by other schools. If you do a study between Theravada and Mahayana and Vajrayana, there can be certain assumptions shared by all the three traditions, because they are Buddhist traditions. But there can be certain things that are not shared across the tradition. So you have to be careful about both. So you can do an inter-religious study, or you can do an intra-religious study. Now, say for example, you can even do a conceptual study between analysis of Rupa in the discourses and analysis of Rupa in the Abhidhamma. Now, within the Theravada Buddhist tradition itself, or within the Vinaya tradition, you can look at the early Vinaya stand and the later Vinaya stand. Because there are important differences between the commentaries and the basic Vinaya. Right? So you can make a study of those differences and similarities within the Buddhist tradition, within the same religious tradition, and between Dhamma and the Vinaya, between early and later suttas, etc. So you can see the comparative studies very, very important things, but you have to be very careful about the basic assumptions between these things. Now we will move on. Comparative studies require knowledge of all the systems that are compared or contrasted. If the two traditions or studies have their own source languages, the researcher needs to know both languages. Although superficial comparisons are possible, such studies are not only not valuable, but also misleading. What I mean by this is this: whenever you study two traditions, you have to be using the sources belonging to those traditions, and you must be able to make use of sources belonging to those traditions. Say, for example, if you are doing a study between Theravada and Mahayana, now Mahayana studies can be in Sanskrit language, also in Chinese language. Theravada studies you can do with Pali language. Okay? But even within Theravada, if you want to study Burmese Theravada, then you have to know Burmese language. If you want to know the Sri Lankan Theravada, then you should be able to read and understand the Sri Lankan Theravada text, not translated into Burmese. And then Laos or Cambodia, you have to be able to understand those texts. Okay? So if different languages involved, then you must be able to read that. In fact, it is not easy. It's not easy. Because suppose it involves learning Chinese, classical Chinese, sometime before starting the real research, you have to spend several years in reading this Chinese text you are going to study. It can take years, actually, long time. So the linguistic study is also very important when you do a comparative study. You can't just do a comparative study otherwise. Now, very often among the Buddhist studies, we have, if a medical doctor comes to study Buddhism, he or she will always want to do Buddhism and medicine. If a lawyer comes to study Buddhism, he or she wants always to do Buddhism and law. What a nonsense. Simply because you know some law and you are a Buddhist by birth, so you think that you can study Buddhism and law. But if you want to study Buddhism and law, you have to have equal qualification for law and Buddhism. Simply because I am a born Buddhist, I can't do Buddhist studies. I can be there are no born lawyers, so you have to get a law degree, and then you have to get a Buddhist degree also. Otherwise, how can you do that? If you want to do Christianity and Buddhism, you know Buddhism, and then you do the Christianity first, and then you do the comparative study. I remember in Sri Lanka there is a very well-known, now he is very old, Roman Catholic father. He is also a very well-known Buddhist scholar called Aloysius Pieris. He has a doctorate in Buddhism, and also he has a doctorate in Catholicism. He told us a very interesting story. When he wanted to do his PhD, he was looking for something, some theme to study. He went to this very great Roman Catholic father who passed away, Etienne Lamotte. Etienne Lamotte is again a very, very great name in Buddhist studies. He was a Roman Catholic father. Lamotte is a Belgian Roman Catholic father. He is so well known all over the world for Buddhist studies. So this Father Aloysius Pieris had met him, and he had told about his idea that he wanted to do a comparative study between Buddhism and Christianity. Right away, this Father Etienne Lamotte had asked, so you are going to compare something you don't know with something you know. Something he knew is Christianity, something he did not know is Buddhism. So he had said, before comparing, you study Buddhism. So what happened was, finally, he came back to Sri Lanka, and he studied Buddhism and got a doctorate. So he has a doctorate in Christianity, he has a doctorate in Buddhism. Then, of course, subsequently, he has written some books on comparing, but he did do comparative study for his PhD. He did one PhD in Roman Catholic tradition, he did another PhD in Buddhism. So actually he studied, you won't believe, Venerable Dhammapala's commentaries. So he is one of the experts in the world on Dhammapala's commentaries. Okay. So he is very good Pali scholar, very good Pali scholar. And also he is also a scholar of other languages like Hebrew, Latin, because in order to study Christianity, he has to know those languages. In order to study Buddhism, he had to study Pali. So like that. Now, that's a very good example for proper comparative studies between two religions. Very often what we think is, simply because we are born Buddhist, or simply because you are a Buddhist monk, you think that you know Buddhism. Sorry for saying this, but simply because by being a Buddhist monk you don't know. You have to study Buddhism. Unless you study Buddhism properly, you don't know Buddhism. Right? So, but simply because I am a Buddhist monk or I am a Buddhist, I can't be doing Buddhist studies. Now I remember when I went to do my own PhD in the United States, so I had my Buddhist degree and first degree and all that. Then, my theme was Western philosophy. So the University of Hawaii asked me to do courses in Western philosophy. So I did courses for more than 2 years. I got a master's in Western philosophy, and then I did more courses. Then only I was fit to do a comparative study between Buddhist philosophy and Western philosophy. They will not allow you to simply do okay, go ahead, comparative, no. And then they said to me, okay, you know Pali and Sanskrit from the Buddhist side, Western side you have to know French and German languages. I had to learn French and German languages, and I passed those examinations. I don't remember much now, but it's about 25 years ago. But still I read a little bit French because French is a little better to me. But I had to pass both French and German examinations. Otherwise they will not allow me to do. So Pali and Sanskrit, they say, okay, no need doing, Pali and Sanskrit, but do these languages. So then actually for my study, I had to have 4 languages: French, German, Pali, Sanskrit. Otherwise you can't do. So this is the proper way of, comparative study, where I will talk about my own research a little bit later. But what I am trying to tell you is, any kind of comparative study has to be done in two traditions. To study, you have to have own source languages. The researcher needs to know both languages. And although superficial comparisons are possible, such studies are not only not valuable but also misleading. Because, you can't really do a superficial study. Just see some superficial similarities. So comparative studies is a very popular thing in the world. But, you get to be very, very careful in doing comparative studies in the proper manner. And sometimes, certain comparative studies are really misleading. Certain comparative studies are really misleading because you want to show some similarities only. You don't want to say some differences, So fundamentally, it is very important to recognize the basic differences of the different traditions. Then only you can do a comparative study, okay? So it is not a superficial thing. So in a way, doing a comparative study can be actually a very difficult thing. If you do it properly, it is not very easy. You have to learn two traditions very well. Then only you can do even Theravada and Mahayana, you have to very well know not only Theravada but also Mahayana. Not only reading one or two books, but also reading the text, Mahayana text, you see. And not only that, today the scholarship in the world is so much. People know so much today. So you can't just be, touching here and there and saying something. Then you become a fool to do that, because, people will laugh at you. So it is very important for you to be, being, the familiar with, both traditions. Finally, let me talk a little bit about one example. That example is from Asanga Tilakaratne's Nirvana and Ineffability, 1993. So this is actually what I did for my PhD. And then the concept of ineffability. Do you know what ineffable means? Ineffable means what you cannot say in language, what you cannot say in concept. Ineffable means, now there is a famous saying, God is ineffable. When you say God is ineffable, God you cannot describe by word. In Chinese philosophy, there is a book called, you may have heard about it, Dao De Jing. Dao De Jing starts with Dao that can be spoken of is not real Dao. So if you can speak about Dao, then that is not real Dao. So the idea is that you can't speak of Dao. So ineffability means basically the idea that there are certain things that you cannot say in language. Now this is basically my theme. This theme comes from basically from Christian religion and Hindu tradition. So both in Hinduism and Christianity, you have the concept of ineffability. In Sanskrit language, it is called Anirvachaniya, Avachya, and then in Sanskrit it's called Anabhilapya. So these are the basic concepts. So you have Avachya, Anirvachaniya, Anabhilapya. So also you have ineffable. So this concept you find in the Buddhist literature, like you find this in Lankavatara Sutra. These two concepts you find in the Hinduism, Avachya, Anirvachaniya. Actually my research was on this theme. Now this connects to when you say there is something that cannot be described in language, so it has a connection to the philosophy of language. And also, what is that thing that cannot be said in language? That is the ultimate goal or God or whatever. So it has a philosophy of religion. So actually my dissertation, my research connected philosophy of religion and philosophy of language. And then I was looking from Buddhist perspective, and I was trying to prove that nirvana is not ineffable. So God is ineffable, Tao is ineffable. In Hindu tradition, Brahmanic tradition, Atman Brahman is ineffable. But I wanted to show that nirvana is not ineffable. So Buddhism is, I wanted to show, basically different from that, okay? So this is basically my research. So I can put it like simply a couple of sentences, but then basically this is what I did the research. So what do we mean by concept of ineffability in the religious traditions, so I surveyed the concept. So, but you see, it's interesting thing is when you talk about something that you cannot describe by language, is common to many religions. Now even in Buddhism, Buddha doesn't say that nirvana is ineffable, but Buddha was familiar with the idea that there can be certain things, so people believe that there are certain things that cannot be said in language. So the concept is common to Indian religion, and concept is common to Western religion. Okay. Now interesting thing is in Buddhist aspect is negative. Although Mahayana has Anabhilapya, in the Theravada tradition, I argue that there is no even a concept. There is no concept, there is no word that says that nirvana is not definable or nirvana is not describable. Even no term. So I was looking at these traditions, on the one hand Christian religious tradition, on the other hand Hindu religious tradition, and on the, but then basically, you may want to know whether I know about Hinduism, Christianity and all these things. Actually what happened was, as a student I studied about Christianity and Christian philosophy, including Western philosophy. And also Hindu philosophy, Brahmanic philosophy also. So, in my graduate career, as a student I studied all these things and took courses. So to get qualified to do this research. I can't simply say that I'm a Buddhist, so I know Buddhism. No, but I had my first degree in Buddhist philosophy, so I had the academic qualification. And then for Christianity and Hinduism, I didn't have degrees, but of course I had to do the courses. So you can see that in a comparative study is not in that sense easy thing. It involves many areas, and you have to be competent in those areas, in those languages. So in my case, I had Pali and also Sanskrit. I could read Hindu literature, Upanishads, or parts of the Vedas I could read. And with Pali, I could read Buddhism. For Western philosophy, of course, if I knew Greek, it would have been much better, but I did not know Greek. They didn't ask me to learn Greek, luckily. So, but in Western philosophy, we read in English. There is no problem. But the Buddhist philosophy you can't do just by reading English. Then you do only through the translations. When it comes to the really high level of research, you just can't do with translations. Okay. So anyhow, the point is that now this is just one example. I am not saying that I wrote it is the best book or something. No, that is not what I want to say. I just want to give you an example how you do example of how do you a comparative study, what are the elements and what are the challenges of, doing a comparative study. It is a challenging thing. Although people can be feeling that, you can compare, but that is not very easy unless you know both traditions. So therefore, I think you get some idea about, the comparative study. But if any of you are interested in doing comparative study, I can always discuss with you more detail about, how to do and what involved. But basically, I think I just managed to say what I wanted to say. So, do you have any questions or comments? Yes, sir.
So as you said, I think it's not easy to make comparative studies. And I would like to know how the problem of we talk in the morning category mistake in the comparative study.
Okay. Reverend, that's a very important question actually, because that is one area in which we have to be very careful, because the category mistake can occur really in can happen in this kind of study. Now, for example, my early example of wisdom literature and wisdom. Suppose you opted to do that research. I mean, in a way that could be a category mistake, because on the one hand you are looking at the literature, on the other hand you are looking at the path. Path involves certain types of things, literature, genre involves different things. So you can't really do a comparative study there. Okay? Now, I mean, that's not a very good example for categorical this thing, but categorical error can happen like that. You are trying to mix up, two things which are not compatible, which belong to two different genres, like that. When we say categorical mistake, of course, it's a very, very precise philosophical term. But out of the examples I gave you, like, even this, the kind of comparative research, somebody can, propose, how to say, two different, totally different categories can be like within the doctrine and philosophical traditions during a particular period and the particular time, particular context, and you are trying to compare or study that comparatively. Let me see whether anything better comes into my mind, because actually nothing automatically comes into my mind to give you an example, because I can remember something like this. Somebody did a research on Kingdom of God and Nirvana. Now, if you look at Kingdom of God, we are talking about traditional language. Kingdom of God is a place where you are gone and born after death, and you will never come back. That's the paradise, and forever. Now, when you compare it with nirvana, so of course, if you can demonstrate the differences, that's fine. But if the writer thinks that at some point these two have to be similar, then of course you are distorting the Buddhist position, or you may be distorting the Christian position either. Because one thing is a psychological state, other thing is a location. Now there can be some of you may not agree with me when I say nirvana is a psychological state. But if you take nirvana as also some kind of location, that's a different. However, say for example, if a person want to do a comparative study between Kingdom of God and Sukhavati Vyuha, now that's a different thing, because in the Sukhavati tradition, in the Mahayana, they believe that Buddha is everlastingly there. So Buddha is everlastingly there. Actually, Buddha is very close to be a god. Now there are the reasons for you to make a comparative study between Pure Land Buddhism and maybe Christianity as well, but not the nirvana concept in the Pali Buddhism. Anyway, these are not coming to category the categorical errors, but of course you are mistakenly taken to be belonging to the same genre, but of course they are not. So in a way we can say they are category mistakes, but in the logical language, when we say categories, you are talking about completely two total different things. So in Buddhist comparative studies, you can have totally unsuitable, not telling concepts, that we can say. If anything better comes into mind, I will let you know, but nothing. But basically what we have is, totally divergent things. So, yes.
Your thesis is very interesting. Nirvana ineffability. Einstein finds E equal to mc squared.
Pardon me?
E equal to mc squared. That is, much is not disappear. I would like to say, expression of mass and energy, it is also nirvana. How do you think?
I don't know about science very much. I mean, it is one thing, if somebody can prove it, Reverend, if somebody can prove it, that's not really a comparative study. That's an interpretation of nirvana. You want to say nirvana is this. Then if you want to prove that, if you can prove that, that's not a comparative study really. That's really a proving that nirvana is this. You understand nirvana to be experience, or you understand nirvana to be this. So, if possible, that's no problem. But, from your point, I will take another point. Namely, sometimes people can try to study Buddhism and science. That can be problematic. That can be that Venerables question, something like category mistake too. Because if you take Buddhism, what is Buddhism? If you take science, what is science? Now, science is basically, of course, you can give many different interpretations, but science is basically a way of acquiring knowledge. Way of acquiring knowledge, science. And also science means basically knowledge. So you can talk about science as knowledge, and also science as a way or method of acquiring knowledge. Now, some people try to compare Buddhism with science. Now, what is Buddhism? I mean, Buddhism is, of course, again, you can give different interpretations, but basically Buddhism is what the Buddha taught is the path to nirvana. Now, if you take that basic sense, Buddhism and science have nothing in common. But, in a superficial manner, you can say, Buddhism, science is knowledge, and Buddhism is also talks about knowledge. Then you can compare and contrast what is meant by science, knowledge, and what is meant by Buddhism as knowledge. That's a different thing. But if you take two different systems together, you can't compare Buddhism and science. You can compare, if you want, compare and contrast knowledge in Buddhism and knowledge in science. Something like that.
So we should try to give a clear understanding of Buddhism. We should to comparative study Buddhism and science to get a clear understanding for everyone, especially they know only science.
Well, you have to be a good scientist to do that. That's only I can say. I'm not a scientist, so I never talk about it. So because I don't want to talk something about I don't know. But I'm not saying that that's a bad project. That's a good project. But you have to know theoretically what science means. I mean, we can know popular science. All of us know popular science. But that is not science really. I mean, science is, even this is science. But that is not. That's technology. But technology is based on knowledge, so you can go to science. But basically, you have to define what science is, and then you have to do the study. Okay. So defining your terms in that sense is very important. Okay. So maybe we will wind up from here, and then now and then you keep on reminding me some of the questions I say I will answer later. Okay. Okay, we will wind up for today. Thank you very much. We will meet tomorrow morning for Nagarjuna discussion. Thank you.